on the page. It says here we've substantially completed our audit. We're done. We're not auditing anymore, but the last step is to get the rep letter from management, and then also your approval of the financial statements after we present them tonight. The audit was conducted in accordance with auditing standards generally accepted in the United States. You'll also see that we had to perform a single audit. So in addition to the generally accepted auditing standards, we also did a governmental auditing standards approach, which just there's some incremental steps that we have to do as part of that. The objective of our audit is to obtain reasonable, not absolute assurance. All that means is we take a sample of transactions from a population, we test the sample, and then draw conclusions from that sample, and then that's how we are able to come up with our opinion. Oh, and I should have said this earlier, I tend to move pretty quickly through this, so feel free to stop me if you have a question. Early on, you would have received a similar communication that described our audit approach or our planned audit approach. Nothing changed as a result of the work that we did. We do expect to issue an unmodified opinion. Sometimes you'll hear that referred to as a clean opinion, so that's what you're looking for. There is other information contained in the financial statements or with the financial statements, the management's discussion and analysis or MD&A, budgetary comparison information, other data that's within the report. We do some additional procedures on that. In some cases, we'll issue an in relation to opinion. In other cases, we actually disclaim an opinion, but we do read it all and make sure it's all materially consistent with the financial statements. As I mentioned, we also did an audit in accordance with government auditing standards. We'll go over those reports briefly as well, but because you expend more than $750,000 in federal funds, we're required to test the compliance with some of those programs. Last two bullets are really just saying what I said first in the first place is we received all the information we asked for and we've received full cooperation from management. We had no issues at all. The results of our audit, the next page, there were really no changes in your accounting practices or policies during the year. No new accounting principles that you'll need to adopt. There's one that we'll go over briefly when we get to the end of this document, but really there was nothing that changed year over year. So when we get to the financial statements, you'll see a lot of the stuff looks very similar. No changes to significant estimates or assumptions that were used in developing significant estimates. This big long box at the end of this page, we do what's called a risk-based audit approach. So at the beginning of the audit, we'll sit down and try to identify the areas of higher audit risk, and really what governs that is either complex accounting rules or significant dollar amounts or significant numbers of transactions. A lot of times that drives additional risk or poor internal controls, and so we'll typically spend a little bit more time on those areas that we consider to be higher risk. The areas that we did spend more time on, just purely because of the dollar amounts mostly, are revenue recognition, just making sure that all the different sources of revenue are being recognized properly, accounts receivable and allowances, just making sure that they're fully collectible, primarily on the utility side. The capital assets and depreciation, obviously very big dollar amounts, and making sure those are all being accounted for properly. Capital lease obligations, making sure you're in compliance with all debt agreements and things like that. Pension reporting. This has already been around for a few years. It's not as complex as we initially, dealing with the first year was obviously a little more complicated, but we still pay a lot of attention to it. You have two cost sharing, multiple employer plans, so it's not too terribly complicated. Going concern, we're required to list that as a high risk area, but it's usually not an issue for most governments. And then estimates, we're always looking to make sure that estimates are reasonable with respect to, like for instance, useful lives of capital assets. And then the box on the next page just again talks about that single audit. Anytime you have to do those compliance procedures, there's just some additional risk related to that. We did have a couple journal entries that are they'll be attached to the representation letter. No, there were no unrecorded misstatements. We didn't find anything that wasn't fixed. And then the financial statements. We assist with the preparation of the financial statements, and as part of that process, we do complete disclosure checklist and make sure that all the required disclosures are included in the footnotes. Internal control over financial reporting. As part of the audit, we obtain an understanding of the control environment that exists within the city. Really, but it's for the purpose of designing our audit approach. We don't issue an opinion on the internal controls. But as we're doing that, if we identify any control deficiencies, we're required to categorize them into one of three categories. So a control deficiency is the lowest level. Just means there should be a control there, but it's really pretty inconsequential that there's not. A material weakness is we believe that this control deficiency is so severe that a material misstatement would not be fixed or corrected or caught. And then a significant deficiency is basically anything in between that we think warrants your attention. We did not identify any material weaknesses, and you haven't had any, and I can't even remember if you've ever had one in the audit. We're not allowed to say there were no significant deficiencies, but if there were any, they'd be listed here, so I'll let you draw your own conclusions. Other required communications. I already mentioned there were no significant changes in our planned audit approach. As part of the audit, we do make inquiries of members of the council, and nothing came out of those inquiries that we think warrants the rest of council's attention. There were no specialized skills or knowledge required for the audit. We were able to conduct the audit with our engagement team. We're not aware of any consultations with other accountants. We look at relationships with related parties. Nothing came out of that we think warrants your attention. We didn't have any disagreements with management. There were no significant difficulties encountered during the audit. Nothing else that came out of the audit that we think warrants your attention. And as I mentioned, the last step is to get that representation letter, and really just puts into writing a lot of the oral representations that are made to us throughout the audit. The next page, independence communication, we're required to be independent as your auditor. This is just an affirmative statement to that effect. And then there's several pages of standards that are going to become effective over the next several years. Many of these probably either had a minimal effect already or won't have any effect. Let me have you go to page 11 at the top of that page. Jackie and I have talked about getting together to discuss this. There's a potential that this one could have an effect on the city in 2020. Yeah, so will it be 2020, right? Or 19?
It'd be 19.
19.
It'd be next year.
So this one could have an effect on you in 19. We'll have to look at this. So this is really aligning so there's the Governmental Accounting Standards Board. They issue standards that affect governments. And then there's the FASB, the Financial Accounting Standards Board, and they issue things that affect for-profit companies. The FASB has always had an asset retirement obligation standard. I've had to implement this before with several other companies. It's really not all that complicated, but it is something that will require some time. Basically, if there is an outside legal obligation for the city to remediate any for instance, sewage treatment facilities, then you're required to establish both a capital asset and a liability on the balance sheet effectively, and that gets accreted and depreciated over time. So it just basically pulls that obligation onto the balance sheet. So Jackie and I will look over that and report back to you on kind of the consequences of that. That was all I had on the wrap document. Do you guys have any questions before I move into the financial statements?
Just one point just to make for the public and certainly for the council. Just if the council did receive copies of the draft financial statements and the audit prior to this meeting, so that's part of the reason why this is summary audit discussion.
Yep. All right, well then I'll move into the financial statements. And here I typically just try to highlight a few things throughout, so we won't spend a lot of time in there, again, unless there are questions based on your earlier review. So again, skipping past the table of contents to our letterhead, which has our new logo there at the top. So this is our audit opinion. It's gotten fairly lengthy. It's 2 pages. The first paragraph just describes what we're auditing, the financial statements, the individual opinion units that we're expressing opinions on, management's responsibilities. That next paragraph, the kind of longer paragraph or longer section on that page is our responsibility. It just describes kind of what I mentioned earlier. Our opinion is at the bottom of that page. It just tells you that we were able to establish or get comfortable that the financial statements are materially accurate and in accordance with GAAP or government or generally accepted accounting principles. The top of the next page, required supplementary information. You've got the MD&A and then the budgetary comparison information for certain funds, and then also the schedules that are required by the pension fund or pension plan. Those are all required supplementary information, and we disclaim an opinion on that because a lot of the information we can't really audit, but we do read it, as I mentioned. And then other information would be any of the other budgetary comparison information, the CFA and all that, the schedule of expenditures of federal awards and things like that. We do issue an in relation to opinion on a lot of that information. And then that last paragraph, again, just reiterates that we did do the audit in accordance with governmental auditing standards. After that is the management's discussion and analysis. It's several pages long. I do encourage you to take a look at it. We'll skip past it and go straight to the statement of net position, which is on page 14. So this is basically the balance sheet for the city as a whole. It's organized between 3 columns. 2 columns, governmental activities, which is all the governmental funds reconciled to the economic resources measurement focus, and then the business type activities, which that'll agree directly to the enterprise funds when we get to those. Really just kind of at a high level, these are on an economic resources measurement focus, meaning there's going to be both short-term and long-term assets and liabilities. It'll contain all deferred outflows of resources, which are best described as kind of like an asset, and then deferred inflows of resources, which are kind of like liabilities. When we get to the governmental fund financial statements, you'll see the distinction in that there aren't any long-term assets or liabilities in those. Some important things to note that we always try to highlight, if you look at the bottom in the total net position, the unrestricted portion, that's the portion that's available for basically the ongoing activities of the city. If you compare your unrestricted portion to your total expenditures, which we'll get to on the next page, you've got about 1.5 years worth in unrestricted in the business or the governmental activities, and in the business type activities, it's almost 2 years. So that's a good indication of health within a town or a city. If there's no questions on that, we'll go to the next page, the statement of activities. This is actually 2 pages that should oppose each other. It's not too terribly difficult to explain otherwise, but it's organized between the governmental and business type activities above, or functions that are different programs within the city, and then down below you've got general revenues, which are really not tied to any specific function, but they are meant to offset the cost of the other areas. So above you've got governmental activities, you've got total expenses of about $14.8 million, and then those are offset by some program-specific revenues, charges for services, grants, and contributions, operating and capital. Those offset those costs in both the governmental activities and the business type activities. The business type activities, those will again agree exactly to the enterprise funds when we get to those. And then all of those costs come down to, if you get to the next page, you'll see that there's a deficit in the governmental activities, but then that's all offset by some of those general revenues, particularly sales tax and property taxes and things like that. In the governmental activities, you improve your position by about 13.2 million, so you're now sitting at about 74.2 million. In the business type activities, you've improved it by 2.3 million to 82.1 million, basically. And overall, 15.5 to 156.3. Any questions on that? So then we'll go into the governmental fund financial statements. And so this is the balance sheet for each of the individual funds within the city. It's organized to present the major funds up front. There's some quantitative thresholds that have to be meant to be considered a major fund. You do elect to present a couple funds as major, I believe, that wouldn't quantitatively meet that threshold. And then anything else that doesn't qualify is in a single column to the right. Again, this is a 2-page document. This is on the current financial resources measurement focus or modified accrual basis. So you don't see any capital assets on here. You won't see any long-term debt. This is just basically assets that are either cash or quickly convertible to cash, or that'll be used, or cash will be used to pay the liabilities. Here again, something we like to point out, the unassigned fund balance in the general fund is 5.5 million, or 5.2 months worth of your expenditures, right, within the general fund. But if you combine that, so if you go to the next page and you combine the assigned and unassigned together, you're about 22.9 million. That's 9.5 months of total expenditures of the city. So again, good indication of health. And then because the governmental fund financial statements are on the current financial resources measurement focus, there's a reconciliation on the next page that takes you from the fund financial statements to the government-wide statement of net position. So here's where you'll see the capital assets coming on, the net pension asset and related deferred inflows and deferred outflows of resources, and then the liabilities associated with compensated absences and some small accrued interest that related to kind of carried over. So this will reconcile from these financial statements to the ones that we presented at the front. The next page is the statement of revenues, expenditures, and changes in fund balance. So this is the income statement. Again, current financial resources measurement focus, so more of a cash flow basis. You improved the fund balance, I think, in most funds. Overall, the fund balance improved by 1.8 million. So your fund balance went from about 21 million to 22.8. And again, there's a reconciliation where you can see depreciation coming onto the statement of activities and then capital outlay backing out. So all of those kind of adjustments to go from the current financial resources measurement focus to the economic resources measurement focus. And then we move into the proprietary funds, which are all enterprise funds. These are your utilities. Really, I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because these are almost identical to the statements that we showed at the front. But I will take you to the cash flow statement. Actually, no, I'm sorry, hold on. Really, the only, if you go to page 24, you can see the statement of revenues, expenses, and changes in fund balance. So everything improved. For the most part, the storm drainage had a small loss, but there was a fairly significant loss in the water fund. And I couldn't remember what that was. It was a project that was abandoned, I believe.
Windy Gap. Right.
There you go.
We were up Windy Gap.
And so there was a fairly large non-cash loss. It was some costs that had been accumulated over time that were written off during the year. So it's, even though it reflects a negative change in position, it was a non-cash. So, and then the next page is the cash flow statement. So everything up until this point, as I mentioned, was full accrual. So here just shows you the sources and uses of cash organized into 4 different areas. So you've got operating cash flows, cash flows from non-capital financing activities, so transfers between funds, capital and related financing activities, so any purchase of capital assets and the financing of those capital assets, and then investing activities. But overall, your cash position improved in all of the funds, and in total, 1.4. I'll skip past the fiduciary activity statements and actually skip through the first few footnotes and take you to page 40. There's really no changes in footnotes 1 through 3, but footnote 40 shows you the capital asset roll forward, so there's some more significant dollar amounts here. So you can see the additions within each of the different categories of capital assets, depreciation expense of the 1.8 million, and then how that gets allocated to the individual programs within the city. This is the governmental activities. On the next page, you'll see the business type activities, and that's where you'll see that $1.6 million construction progress that got written off during the year. Again, these will all agree to the statements in the front. Next page shows the governmental activities debt. You can see you paid off your debt during the year. Now really all you're carrying now is the compensated absences in the governmental activities. The business type activities, you have about $40.7 million in debt. One was the Colorado Water Resource and Power Development Authority note was paid off, or one of them was. The other one's pretty close. It'll be paid off in the next year. You really just have that one 2016 and then the 2013 notes. Going to the bottom of page 44, get past the defined contribution plan. You have 2 pension plans, basically the hybrid and the statewide plan. They're both FPPA plans. They're both cost sharing, multiple employer plans, and they both have net pension assets. So really, it's not as consequential as if you were in para where you've got these massive liabilities. So probably won't spend as much time on that. And these footnotes are literally almost 15 pages long between the 2 of them. So, that's about all I'll spend on that. If you want to skip to page, well, it's page 92 in this document. It'll be 83. It's another one of our opinions. It follows the budgetary comparison information. That, or if you find the local highway finance report, it's right after that.
After this schedule.
Yeah,
The local highway, you said?
Yeah.
Right, okay, that.
the one with a bunch of black boxes on it.
Right.
Just a couple opinions I was going to go over. So this is the governmental auditing standards opinion. It just tells you that we did evaluate the town's or the city's internal controls, and then also compliance with federal funding and within the governmental auditing standards. Again, didn't have any material weaknesses or significant deficiencies, didn't have any findings relating to compliance. The next opinion, which is also 2 pages long, is the uniform guidance opinion or the single audit opinion. This is where we actually selected a program from your scheduled expenditures or federal awards, which we'll go to in a second. And we actually tested it against the compliance requirements that you're required to maintain and didn't have any issues with that either. So that's the report on that. When you skip to after that is the schedule of findings and questioned costs. There's no across the board, no material weaknesses, any of that. The program we selected was the disaster grants funds or the FEMA stuff. You continue to be a low-risk oddity, which is good, so we have no issues there. The schedule of expenditures of federal awards is on page 87. At the bottom of that page, the 3.8 million is basically the one of the program that we tested. That's kind of it.
Questions of Mr. Watkins or of staff? Jackie?
I have none.
I got no questions. I'd like to thank you, Mr. Watkins, and your company for all the good work. It looks like our staff's doing a phenomenal job spending our money where it's supposed to be spent.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This is one time of the year, we've heard the good news where I want to just thank the finance staff and the work that Jackie and the team
Yeah.
have done, because it's really no small thing to not have findings in especially the single audit on our federal grant funds. That's really tough, and Jackie has a lot of experience, and I know has just brought that to the team. I'll also just mention, if council heard, we have paid off the library debt that we had, so the general fund is largely debt-free from typical considerations of that, so I think that's important too. So we're making good progress, and we know we have a ways to go in some other areas, but it is good news that we have a clean audit opinion.
Yep.
Yes, thank you
Thank
for all
you.
your work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great job. For your team. They were great to work with as always, so.
Awesome. You'll just let us know. They'll approve it then.
Yep. Thanks, Randy.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you.
Watkins.
Thank you. I have a stack.
Next item on the agenda is the 2019 first quarter budget revision, and we'll hear from staff.
Thank you, Mayor. This is an annual process that we have to update our annual budget based on updated information and needs that we have following the close of the previous year. So you just heard the audit results, and now we're going to move forward into 2019. I just want to give a couple of real high-level overview points, and then turn this over to Jackie for more detail. We had a strong year in 2018. As council might recall, our process is typically to budget fairly conservatively on both revenues and expenditures. And then after we finalize or close out the budget year, we come back to council with any unanticipated revenue that we might have, and we recommend to you kind of one-time investments we can make in the community, typically capital items, catching up on deferred capital, doing lots of that kind of thing, making sure that our reserves are where they need to be with that money that was unanticipated, either on the revenue side or on the expense side. So that's what we have for you tonight. We do have some good news that based on that amount of unanticipated revenue and I think good savings that we had on the expenditure side, we have several $1 million that we're recommending that we reinvest back into the community in the form of stronger reserves, first and foremost, and then also things like deferred capital and future transportation needs that we've prioritized. So that's, I think, the high-level gist that I wanted to share, and now I'll ask Jackie to move through some of the detail.
Great, thank you. We'll move right in. I'm waiting for you to give people an opportunity to shake their heads a little bit from one finance thing to the other,
Right.
but we're going right in, so let's go. We will start with general fund 2018 actuals. I'll keep it high level since Randy did talk to a few of those items. I think what we want to say again is that for 2018, we were really pleased with the ending results. So our original budget for 2018 anticipated us ending the year with somewhere around $9.4 million in that fund balance. We did have some revision items through the year, carry forwards of capital projects similar to what we're going to talk about next. Our 2018 actual year, again, much stronger than we had even anticipated. You'll notice our revenues there, about $16.6 million. That's $2.2 million over our final budget. So largely sales tax related, also due to building permits and that development coming in. All of those have a ripple effect for those revenues that we've seen. Our total ending fund balance for 2018 was $11.1 million. So you'll see that's a $3.8 million difference from our final budget. And that gave us the ability to really sit back, look at our financials, look at the needs that maybe we've been pushing off for the last couple years, hedging that uncertainty a little bit and recommending that now is the time to spend some of those excess dollars with some one-time projects, which we'll talk about. Overall, revenue was 15% over budget. Just graphically here, you'll see sales tax is, again, our largest driving force for revenues in the general fund. You'll see there how much over budget we were. Property taxes were large again. Other taxes represent our severance and federal mineral lease income, also due to the industrial sector there. License and permits and other intergovernmental pieces, pretty strong as well. On the sales tax side, just looking 2017 to 2018 actual, we were about $1 million over 2017 actual. Historically speaking, when we've had really good years or really bad years, they've come in about $1 million swings, which is kind of an interesting piece there. And also why it's so important for us to continue to budget conservatively. If we have that downward swing, we don't want to be caught $1 million decline the other way. So always kind of watching that. Again, our industrial sector is big. It was 12% over the prior year. Our base is everything else, big that we watch closely as well, 11% there. Our storefront retail is a category that we broke out separately not long ago, also a 9% increase there. The motor vehicle there has been our interesting force throughout the year, so it's 27% over what we saw in 2017. So the months that we thought were really high in motor vehicle, we kept seeing them grow and increase every month. So that's been kind of an interesting one to watch. For 2019, our overall sales tax budget is about $8.2 million. So we wanted to also be conservative, as I know we've talked here, but also be realistic about what we were expecting for the year.
And if I could just underscore one thing Jackie said, a lot of this revenue, a lot of our economic base is from the oil and gas industry. So we budget that conservatively because we know it can be very volatile. But if you look at those categories like certainly the industrial category, the motor vehicle category is a lot of our oil and gas companies buying vehicles. And then of course those base and storefront and restaurant categories also are strongly supported by the strong oil and gas industry. So the concerns and the discussions council's had about potential legislative effects could be seen there. So we need to be grateful that we had a strong year, and we also still need to be very cautious that could swing the other way.
Absolutely. Thanks for that.
Thanks.
So here you'll just see from 2016 to 2017, we did see a 9% increase, and then again a 12% increase from 17 to 18. We have reported out based on February numbers. We do have Marches as well at this point, but we're already about 10% over 18 so far into 19. So we're continuing to see positive trends, at least this far into the year. On the expenditure side for the general fund, we were 9% under budget. So you can see this breaks out by general functional program in the general fund. We did have savings among each function. This was a combination of salary savings, project savings, and some carry forward items that weren't completed and spent in full in 2018 that we'll ask for that budget to be rolled forward to 19. But across the board, folks did good about managing their budgets. As I mentioned, you'll see that then in each category: payroll, S&S is our supplies and services, our capital and asset management, all had some savings in there. We spent less in the ending flood recovery program than we thought. So overall, we had about $1.5 million of savings on the expenditure side from the final budget to 2018 actuals. On the enterprise funds, keep this fast as well. We always look at what the revenue and related expenses are for the various enterprise funds. So we had about $6.4 million of total revenue in the water fund, primarily from service revenues. About $5.5 million expenses due mostly to water treatment costs and that sort of thing. So we did have a positive change in net position with that fund and an ending cash balance of just shy of $9 million. Oh, sorry. I saw 6.9 tonight. Yep, 7, thank you. You guys are paying attention. This is great. I was just on the base rate side, you'll see about $2.2 million of revenue there. Those fixed operational costs are offset against that, and our net revenue for base in the water fund is about $643,000. And that net basically goes to fund, deferred maintenance of water. On the variable side, our net revenue, we're really close there. Anything additional on the variable side would go to other water conservation efforts. So this is an area that, we continue to look at base versus variable rate in our water fund and that structure, and that number is usually very close. On the wastewater fund, we had about $17.7 million total revenue. That other revenue, large amount there, is our revenue proceeds from the construction of our wastewater plant and that loan. So that'll be the last year we see a big number there. 2018 total expenses, just over $10 million. So again, as Randy mentioned, we saw, again, a positive increase to the water or wastewater fund. And then the ending cash balance is about $7.3 million.
One point here, especially
Yes,
on the wastewater fund, any of those positive variances that you see are in large part programmed out over time for long-term expenses. That's a pretty tight business model that we keep on that plant so that we can ensure we have money for long-term needs. So that's why a lot of that is there.
Absolutely. On the storm drainage side, revenues just shy of $560,000, and expenses there $348,000. Again, a lot of it is service costs, and then the overhead transfer back to the general fund from the storm drainage. Positive change in net position again, and as you heard in the last presentation, a good strong ending cash balance there as well, $1.4 million. Budget to actual, you'll see the red column there represents the actual in relation to expenses. So we did a good job, I think, of minimizing where we could some of those that were in our control. Moving into the budget revision items. So we did have such a strong year in 2018. This is the time of the year that we look at, not only what we would like to do with any excess funds, but also carrying forward last year's budget that maybe wasn't completed in 2018. So this really is a best practice to make sure that we're not paying for things that aren't completed until we're satisfied with them. So it is a very normal process to come back and ask for the items be reappropriated in the current year to finish those projects. There's a lot going on in this sheet. This should have been in your handouts as well. We start with the 2019 beginning fund balance, and we look at the amount that's in excess of our reserve. So as this group has adopted those financial policies and those reserve policies, 40% of the prior year's operating expenditures is held in the just in case. It's the economic downturn, the investment opportunities, a large taxpayer leaving the city, those kinds of things. We do feel that it's prudent to go ahead and add an extra 10% on top of that at this point in case we see any kind of increase in the industrial sector. So we are looking at what's available after we take 50% of our reserves kind of off the table. And that gets us to that bolded $4.4 million number that would be available after those reserves would be satisfied. Any note on that before we go?
Nope, just
Okay.
as a rule, I think first thing we do is make sure we're covered for our potential losses. And that's why first thing we think we should do is add 10% to the reserves.
We do have a lot of these items identified individually in the staff report that was out, as well as that attachment A kind of with the green header. That's the only place that those are listed individually. They're kind of grouped here a little bit. So I'll go through them on this sheet. We have $1.5 million for additional funding on 37th Street for future construction. That's an item we know won't be spent right away. Again, if something needed to be pulled back due to unforeseen circumstances in this year, that's something that we could, council could evaluate and see if that's the right timing to spend that money as well. We have an additional transfer of pavement management of $250,000 that would be in excess of the existing $600,000. Funding for future Highway 85 corridor improvements. So we've got $400,000 there to continue that project. Demolition of existing ERA agency structure. So $350,000 pending additional environmental work that will need to be done that will be transferred to the ERA to begin demolition on those sites. Then we kind of get into the grouping. So we have deferred maintenance items. There's $552,000 there. There are items that are the should have dones. The now that we have money, we really need to look at, these will become more expensive the longer that we wait on some of these items. Oh, that's okay, I've got them here as well, thank you. So the big ones in there, $350,000 of that would be for grading and repaving of the parking lot here at the city complex. Sure, as you drove in today, you saw that it's deteriorating at a quick rate. $60,000 to replace the remaining 2 HVAC units to keep that structure working here at this building. $40,000 to repair leaking sections of this roof. So we've decided to try to hold off on replacing the overall roof and try a repair structure that Brian Stone is pretty confident will work at this point. So that's great to have an option. A couple smaller things. Upgrading some cameras in this building in the area, and some repairs to City Park maintenance and storage building, and repairs to a road grader. So those are all items that we think are necessary and can't continue to be pushed off. We have a couple items that are under the title of long-range planning and street design, and those are roadway design for 23rd Avenue going south, about $100,000. $150,000 to update our comprehensive plan and our transportation master plan, and then $75,000 to due to increased development and planning costs that we're seeing coming in. So that'll just help that budget meet that need. We have technology investments. I won't go into each one of those. A couple of them are pretty small. There's a $40,000 item in there to upgrade the pavement monitoring system. I probably butchered that terminology. Pavement management, thank you. And that'll allow us to survey all the streets of the city in kind of one swap. I think everyone's pretty excited about. Expected Mark to cheer a little bit about that. Nothing. So we have a couple police personnel and transition cost items, about $21,000 there that that police budget needs. Every year we do request a small amount of sales tax auditing program funds be carried forward. This isn't something that we budget in the initial budget for the year. We wait to make sure that that program is bringing in revenues and is paying for itself, and then we do ask for an additional budget to continue that. We have police asset forfeiture program. Council heard a couple meetings ago about adopting that new structure for asset forfeiture. So we do want to include in the budget what we expect might be some equipment purchases out of that. Our carry forward expenditures for the items that were budgeted in 18 that we would like to have reappropriated in 19 to finish is about $317,000. And these are items that are on the first page of that attachment A. Again, a few small items, but I will draw your attention to about $44,000 of repairs to our property and vehicles from hail and windstorms. We do have some residual costs to complete all of those repairs. Hopefully we're not getting back into that season right now again. Purchasing a mower that was back ordered, we weren't able to get it done before year end. Police vehicle, a few items that were all began and not able to be completed. So that is the bulk of those items. So the total of our funding recommendations of each of those categories there is $3.8 million, 3.9. We have 4 items that we'd also like to recommend be spent out of the traffic calming surcharge that's attached to police tickets. We do hold that restricted revenue for items that benefit the overall public safety of a community. So we have about $91,000 there. They are essentially either intersection signage or traffic cameras or traffic control boards that will help traffic flow and safety. The net of a couple of revenue pieces that will help with those bring our total of requests just under $4 million. So that $3.897 million number. So if you do the math there at the bottom, that does still leave us $500,000 of excess revenue or excess reserves, in addition to the 50% that we would be holding. And again, we've looked at a few of those items that could be phased in future years that wouldn't be spent right away, that would kind of help that as well if something happened. We're not writing a check for $4 million tomorrow. So we have kind of looked at the phasing of that. Are there any questions on any of the revision items before we move on or anything?
Is there more presentation?
Yeah, are we running out of time?
No, I just want to make one point here that there was a good question asked by the Finance Committee who saw these recommendations 2 weeks ago regarding exposures on some legal issues that we have. And just to reiterate, if your total fund balance right now is about 11.1 million, of the things on that list there, we're recommending that about 1.9 would be spent this year. Several of the large dollar items there would be spent in future years that we think it's wise to set some money aside for. But that means that if we're spending, say, around to $2 million of the 11.1, you would still have $9 million approximately in your fund balance as we move through the remainder of 2018 and hope to resolve those issues. So we are cognizant of them. We think this is still responsible given the exposures that we have. And I just wanted to kind of circle back on that.
Well, I think before we continue on, I just wanted to, I've looked at this and I got to see this in the budget committee. And as being a person who lives on the east side of town and representing the East Ward 1, I'm a little disturbed over how much is not being spent on the east side. It looks like we're gonna have about 28,000 at Riverside Park, and then 55,000 at City Park for a building repair that really doesn't help the citizens out. I know that I've put out there that I would like to have quiet zones through the railroad crossings. We like to have paving on some of the gravel roads that are out there. And there's also a big issue with storm drainage, as you guys probably know. That's the farthest, the lowest on the drainage, and we always get all the drainage. So anytime there's a big rainstorm, we have drainage problems. It's kind of disturbing that out of $1.9 million, basically we're going to have $28,000 spent over east of the railroad tracks.
Can I ask a question on that? Out of any of that money spent there, tell me where it's being spent, that it's not for everybody in the city. I don't see anything up there that's just Ward 3 or just Ward 2. That's for everybody.
Well, I guess we're going to spend more time going through the city. So.
Do you see what I'm saying? No, there's
Well,
nothing
I
up there
understand
that's
what
like
you're
all the
saying,
money's
Brian,
being
but
spent
I'm
west.
also understanding that everything that's on here is for everybody to use on that side of the city.
What up there is
so-
just for that side of the city though?
The 37th Street, well, yeah, okay, that's fine. I mean, if we continue to neglect the east side, then it's gonna continue to go downhill, so.
By no means am I saying neglect the east
So
side, but I don't see
you're saying that the
anything.
citizens over on that side of the city wouldn't deserve to have quiet zones and railroads?
That's not what I'm saying at
So that we
all.
can enjoy our life too?
It's not what I'm saying whatsoever.
know.
What I'm saying is show me one thing up on that board that's just for the west side of the city. Just point one out.
Well, you know
Because
what?
there's not one.
Probably because I haven't looked at that, because I've been more concerned about what we can do to help with the east side of the city too.
I'm all for helping everybody, especially the east side of the city. I'm just saying there's not one thing on that page
Yeah.
that is just for the west side of the city.
Okay,
Everything on that page is for the whole city.
well, thank you. We appreciate it.
Okay, let's go ahead and move on.
The general fund update as it looks for 2019 then, we've looked at 2018 past kind of historical results, what we'd like to do with some of that excess, and now kind of bringing that back to what that'll mean current times. Our 2019 adopted budget, that first column there, we anticipated our ending fund balance to end us with about $7 million. Because we did have such a strong year in 2018, you'll notice that very first line, instead of starting the year with $8 million, we are starting with that 11.1, which is a great thing to be sitting here reporting. What we'd like to do with that then is, as we just talked through those items, spend just shy of $4 million. You'll see that kind of sitting there as that spring carry forwards and allocations line. What that'll mean to our general fund is about $6 million of ending fund balance at that point. In that third column, as that would be allocated out to the various components, then you would see that expenditure number go from about 14.7 to just over 16 million. We would have the capital of 850,000, the transfers out to the other funds to complete those other capital projects of 1.8. Again, that ending fund balance there is about $6 million. The other good news part two of this is that we are still seeing the sales tax collections higher than what we had anticipated even now. And we do expect a lot of those revenue projections to continue being strong for this year. At this point, we do expect our revenue to be about $1 million over budget at this point. And as we continue to then spend what we're recommending tonight, that would mean our ending fund balance would be just over $7 million. So the $237,000 number there that sticks out at the bottom is over what we originally planned for 19. So strong year, increasing that fund balance, continued increased revenues allow us to project that we could spend this amount of money and still be at a positive standpoint, $237,000 more than what we had originally planned for this year. So I think overall, if you had any kind of sticker shock about the number, we've really looked at every angle to make sure that we're comfortable in recommending the spend. And I think that $237,000 helps that piece. We did just want to show that we did have almost $2 million of requests come in when we looked at what needed to be spent for unfunded pieces. These are items that the need won't go away on, and likely you'll hear, hopefully we have another positive year, and these are items we can discuss for next year.
We have a pretty vigorous discussion at the management team level about these priorities and what we're recommending. And we just wanted to share a little flavor of those things that departments are saying we really need to do, but that we still need to hold off given, I think, a responsible plan.
Sneak peek for next year, maybe. There are governmental funds. So to Councilmember Spears' point about other needs, not everything is the general fund. And it is not paid by sales tax revenues either. So we do have a number of road projects that we're continuing to carry forward. 35th Avenue widening, you'll see in a couple different funds. In the CIP streets, the bulk of our road work, 37th Street, 47th Street, the construction on 35th Avenue to do the widening there, updating our engineering specifications, continuing to fund the park. The remaining kind of preliminary budget revisions items that you guys approved for Riverside Park are included in here then to be trued up with the budget. So those are all projects that are going that we need to have carried forward to 19 to continue to work on. You'll see at the bottom there the closeout of fund for the lease repayment fund. That was the fund we were using to pay off the Riverside Library debt. So now that that's complete, about $21,000 will come back to the general fund as well. On the enterprise side, a multitude of projects, storm drainage being the largest up here. For water and wastewater, those are carry forward projects. Only those are the items that started in 18 that need to be carried forward for 19. The first few for storm drainage are also the same. The bottom four, are all items that are new storm drainage projects in relation to the increased storm drainage rate.
Right. So these are planned to be some of the design costs for the approximately $5 million worth of stormwater projects that we'll be undertaking with the increased stormwater fees over the next few years. So those are important to get moving on.
Right. So I won't go through them. Most of them are items that were approved in 18, but be happy to pause if there's any questions on any carry forward items on any of the other funds, not general fund related. Right. Don't have much of a conclusion here. We've looked at probably more numbers than anyone wanted to look at tonight. But ultimately I'm glad that Mr. Watkins could be here tonight to kind of give also the snapshot of where we ended 2018. We feel that hopefully 2019 will continue for a while into this year and continue to provide those strong numbers again. But with that, this is the budget revision for 2019. If there's any other questions, I'd be happy to.
With council's feedback tonight,
Yeah.
we'll bring back the final recommendation to you for your consideration at your next council meeting.
Questions of staff?
Thank you.
What's that?
Comment.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Everyone involved in this, you guys did an amazing job, and because of all of you, we're able to finish out strong and then continue on a great year. So I'm excited. Thank you.
All right. All right, thanks.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Next item on the agenda is Police Department 2018 Annual Report.
Thank you, Mayor. We do like to keep council updated on our police department activities, and this is the first annual report that we've had in a while, and I'll turn it over to Chief Brandt to give an update, probably a brief overview. You do have the hard copy version of the report at the dais, and I know you had also received it. But this is just a summary for you this evening, so take it away, Chief.
Thanks, Jim. Good evening, council. So as you can see, it's a new format. We're trying something new. The delay, we're a little bit late getting this to you this year.
I wasn't gonna call it out.
Well, I'm going to because it's almost mid-year. Largely due to the fact that we changed our records management system last year, and trying to compile the data was a lot more daunting than we thought it would be, trying to get data from the two systems. But the new system should make this much easier for us in the future. So, I'll be interested in some feedback over time about what you think about the overall format. I want to just touch briefly on some of the highlights from the report. Community engagement, you can see on page 5 quite a few events that we were involved in. Largely, I think the ones that are most involved with our community, the prescription drug take back, that's always a really good event. We did the Coffee with a Cop this year. That was also a well-attended event. And then, of course, Special Olympics is one of those things that are very near and dear to my heart and those of the officers. So we have a lot of participation in those. On page 6 and 7, just some recognitions this year of some of the outstanding work done by your officers. You may recall that Officer Police McClatchy was recognized as the Colorado Association of Chiefs of Police Officer of the Year last year for her work in our city, and that was probably the most noteworthy, or the one that received the most press. But every year we also recognize the work of other officers throughout the year. We had a couple of life-saving awards this year, and some other incidents. And
I think you got off on that.
Oh, what happened?
For the audience, thank you.
Officer Troy McDaniel was nominated as our Officer of the Year in Evans for his outstanding work. If you guys know him, you probably are aware of his outstanding work. We hired 4 new officers in 2018 to our staff, just getting us up to authorized levels, and we've created 2 new sergeant's positions in 2018 in an attempt to redeploy our patrol services in a more efficient manner. Investigations unit. So it's a 3-officer or 3-detective unit. Their caseload keeps them all pretty busy. A couple things I wanted to point out. They're largely responsible for the clearance rates that we enjoy in our city, and we do have a fairly high clearance rate capacity for our crimes. The only place we didn't meet or exceed state averages was in theft, but otherwise the officers do the detectives do a really good job of getting on top of cases and clearing them. One area of note that may have drawn your attention in the annual report was the number of new sex offender registrations we had. We had 43 last year. Those are just the new ones coming in. We don't report the ones going out, but we usually maintain somewhere around 65 to 70 constant. So we have a lot of transitional folks coming out of prison, stopping here, moving on, working here, moving on. So we're not really increasing our population at an alarming rate. I've highlighted some of the major cases from 2018. We had our first bank robbery in the history of Evans, anybody can remember, and that critter's in jail. So 1 for 1 on the bank robberies.
There were 2 of them. Did you get them both?
There was 2, yes, there was a getaway driver, so we did
Okay.
get them both, yeah.
Got 'em both.
Yeah, so kind of exciting. Our traffic enforcement efforts and our calls for service, we saw a decrease of about 8% in calls for service. Still pretty high. We're still getting 20-some thousand calls for service a year. Traffic accidents, we saw a slight increase over 2017. Injury accidents have a kind of a scary number there, up 60%. That number actually just translates to 22 in 2017 versus 35 last year. None of them were serious injury, and it could be anything from a cut finger, but there was no serious injuries at all. We had no traffic fatalities in 2018. And then our impaired drivers were up significantly as well, and indicating that we're attributing much of that to the legalization of marijuana and the poly drug use, marijuana, alcohol, meth is still, that kind of stuff. So we are seeing an increase in there. And we're still focusing heavily on targeted enforcement efforts, especially using CDOT funding to target impaired drivers. So we're still working very hard to curb that and try to mitigate that in the future. And page 12, just reporting on crime. You can see that in the Part 1 crimes, we had a 57% increase in aggravated assaults. And part of that is the way the state classifies assaults as opposed to the way we do it. But largely, in just reviewing the data preliminarily, it looks like most of those are domestic violence related. So either there's some sort of serious bodily injury involved or a weapon involved that would elevate it to that level. But we're not getting calls of weapons in fights in the streets and that sort of thing. It appears to be an anomaly in the domestic violence side of the equation.
Chief, it might be worth a mention that we think also a number of those, this was the first full year that we had the cold weather shelter. And so, I know that that team who's managing that has been making a lot of changes, but there are a fair number of, fights and things that happen on that premises. So I think that's one of the
That may be one of the factors. And we're seeing overall about a 34% increase in calls for service in a half-mile radius around the cold weather shelter over the last 2 years. So we are getting more and more calls based on the population that they're servicing. Part 2, we don't do Part 2s. So overall, we're down 1% in Part 1 crimes, which I think is noteworthy, and seeing a continual decline, a slow decline. The co-responder program is proving to be pretty successful moving forward. Our first full year, we're learning how to use these people more effectively and use them more often. We've had 68 call-outs in 2018. Out of those, 40 were resolved on scene by the co-responders, so that got the officers off the scene and back into service and started providing services to people who are experiencing some sort of behavioral health issue or crisis. We are refocusing for this year moving forward. We're going to take them out of the solely crisis response mode and offer them or bring services to things like domestic violence, runaway children, and other behavioral issues that we haven't tried before. So we're going to try to expand some of their service levels. And we still have one opening in Evans that we're waiting to fill. Very difficult to find somebody that fits that mold. That's a behavioral health specialist, a clinician who is usually former addict because they're peers of these folks and they can relate to them and they can work in a police environment. So the hiring has been a challenge, but we have somebody we hope to get online here in late May. And just some of the goals we have outlined for this year. We are hoping to find a way to increase our analytical capabilities in-house now that we have the RMS system that provides us data that's very usable. Now we need a way or perhaps resources to help us start identifying crime trends so we can target resources more effectively. We've not staffed our traffic unit in a year. If you looked at the data earlier on traffic enforcement, our traffic tickets were down significantly last year, and that's largely due to the fact I don't have a full-time traffic officer assigned. So we're hoping to get that staffed before mid-year of this year and get back into that. I am pleased to say, though, that accidents didn't go up substantially by the lack of that level of enforcement. We're working really diligently with the cold weather shelter. As I mentioned, we're seeing spikes in that whole area of crime. The businesses are being affected all around that area, so we're working with them, their staff, and working with the local businesses, trying to mitigate some of those issues. The Spillman's record system is up and running. That was a goal coming into the year. The reinstatement of the master police officer program actually became effective yesterday, so that's a go. We're doing a Sergeant's Promotional Assessment Center mid-year. That was one of the unanticipated expenses that Jackie mentioned on the budget revision. We didn't know we were going to have an opening this year. And we're experimenting with some new community feedback channels. So social media, we're trying a more immediate response on inquiries on social media, where Lance is forwarding stuff right away to the appropriate officer. We're responding to citizens' inquiries. And we're also having the sergeants do random contacts. So they'll go through an officer's call log and just call somebody and say, hey, officer responded out there on vandalism, and we have a series of questions on customer satisfaction, so to speak, on them. And then we're also working with Lance because we're seeing an uptick in motor vehicle thefts, about 22% over 2017. He's putting together, working with me and my staff, a public service series of announcements to try to get people more focused on watch your car, don't leave it running, and that sort of thing. So we are working on a number of mitigation efforts where we are seeing increases in crime. So with that, we have about 10 seconds.
Quick comment, just that following this presentation, this report will be available on our website. We'll be promoting it via social media. And we'll also have hard copies here at our offices for people.
Thank you. We got about 1 minute if anybody's got a quick comment or question for Chief.
Chief, I received quite a table full of comments at lunch today about the number of homeless people passing through Evans.
Yeah.
I made the mistake of going over and greeting somebody from the north side or from the east side of Evans. They got into talking about the homeless population and how it's my fault for letting them come into Evans. And it's like, there's nothing I can do to stop them.
We're working as diligently as we can with the shelter and trying to build that strong relationship.
One thing in that it is important, now that the shelter's closed for the year, we're gathering data. We're gonna be back with council to have some more conversation about strategies to both support, but also make sure that the impact is more limited as we move forward there.
It's a difficult situation to deal with, and especially for the people that are in that position. So.
It is difficult.
Great, thank you. Get set to start the meeting here soon.